Taeho Kim pressed his face against the cold metal of the observation deck window and watched the stars shimmer like broken glass against the dark void of space. 300 years had passed since humanity first met the galaxy, and every alien species knew one simple rule that nobody questioned. Human space was where the galaxy ended and nobody went beyond that line. The survey vessel Horizon's Edge drifted slowly through the outer regions of human territory, carrying its usual crew of scientists and one very unusual passenger. The Veltaran ambassador stood nearly 8 feet tall with 4 arms and skin that looked like polished green metal. Its compound eyes clicked and whirred as they focused on different objects around the ship's bridge. Youngmei Park had been studying the creature for 3 days now and still found its movements fascinating. The way it moved reminded her of a praying mantis, but with the careful grace of a diplomat. Surveyor Kim. The ambassador spoke through its translation device with a voice that sounded like wind chimes in a storm. Your species guards the edge of known space with such dedication, yet you never speak of what lies beyond. Taeho turned from the window and smiled the same practiced smile he had used with hundreds of curious aliens over the years. Captain Jun Lee watched from his command chair as his best surveyor handled the delicate situation. They all knew this conversation would come eventually. Ambassador, Taeho said, we have found that some questions are better left unasked. Young Mia looked up from her scanning equipment and felt a chill run down her spine. She had been part of the survey team for 2 years, but had never been this close to the boundary that everyone called the silent dark. Her instruments showed nothing unusual, but something felt wrong in a way she could not explain. The Veltarans had tilted in what might have been confusion or curiosity. Your people speak of the silent dark as if it were alive, yet my government's long-range sensors detect only empty space beyond your borders. Captain Jun Lee stood up from his chair and walked over to join the conversation. He was a man who had spent 40 years in space and had learned to trust his instincts about danger. Right now, those instincts were screaming at him to change the subject. Ambassador, the captain said, perhaps we should focus on the stellar formations in this sector rather than the regions beyond our patrol routes. But the Veltaran was not easily distracted. Its forearms gestured toward the main view screen, which showed the edge of human space as a line of defense satellites and monitoring stations. 3 centuries ago, when the collective first made contact with humanity, your borders were much smaller yet. Now they form a perfect barrier across this entire spiral arm of the galaxy. Youngmi's equipment suddenly started beeping in rapid patterns that made everyone on the bridge turn to look at her station. Her face had gone pale as she stared at readings that should not exist. Captain, she said with a voice that barely managed to stay steady, I'm detecting an energy signature from beyond the boundary. Taeho was beside her in 3 quick steps, looking over her shoulder at the display. What he saw there made his blood turn cold. The signature was massive and artificial and definitely not human. How far beyond the line? Captain Jun Lee asked as he moved to his command station. Approximately 50 light-years past the furthest monitoring post, Young Mi replied. But Captain, the size of this thing is impossible. The Veltaran ambassador moved closer to the scanning station with excitement, clearly visible in its body language. This is exactly what the collective hoped to find, evidence of ancient civilizations beyond human space. Taeho looked at Captain Jun Lee and saw the same grim expression he had learned to recognize over the years. It was the look of a man who knew secrets that weighed heavily on his soul. Ambassador, Taeho said carefully, I need you to step away from the scanning equipment. But surely this discovery changes everything. The Veltaran insisted, if there are ruins or artifacts beyond human space, then the scientific value alone. Step away from the equipment, Taeho repeated with a tone that made it clear this was not a request. Captain Jun Lee was already giving orders to his crew. All hands prepare for immediate departure from this sector. Young Mi looked confused as she continued monitoring the strange readings. Captain, the energy signature is getting stronger and it seems to be moving. The Veltaran ambassador's compound eyes focused intently on the display screen. Moving toward us or away from us? Toward a... Young Mi whispered. That was when everything changed. The lights on the bridge flickered and a sound like distant thunder rolled through the ship's hull. But it was not really a sound because sound could not travel through space. It was something else entirely. Something that touched their minds, directly. Tejo grabbed the nearest support rail as a wave of wrongness washed over him. It felt like standing at the edge of a cliff and looking down into an endless fall, except the cliff was inside his head, and the fall was into something that had no name. Young Mai screamed and fell backward from her station. The readings on her equipment were now showing impossible values that made no sense according to any known physics. Captain Jun Lee's voice cut through the chaos. Emergency jump coordinates laid in, all hands brace for immediate departure. But the Veltaran ambassador was not bracing for anything. It was standing perfectly still in the center of the bridge with all four arms hanging limp at its sides. Its compound eyes had stopped moving and were now fixed on something that nobody else could see. Ambassador Tejo called out, but got no response. The wrongness in his mind was getting stronger now. It felt like something vast and hungry had noticed their little ship and was reaching out across the void to touch them. Every instinct he had developed over years of deep space survey work was telling him to run as fast and as far as possible. Captain Jun Lee activated the jump drive without waiting for confirmation from the ambassador. The ship lurched as reality twisted around them, and suddenly they were 50 light-years away from the boundary, floating in safe, familiar space near a human monitoring station. Young Mai was sitting on the floor, holding her head in her hands. What was that thing? Tejo helped her to her feet and noticed that his hands were shaking, something that should have stayed hidden. The Veltaran ambassador finally moved, but when it turned to face them, something had changed in its posture. The confident curiosity was gone, replaced by what looked like terror. "Your people," the ambassador said with a voice that no longer sounded like wind chimes, "do not guard the galaxy's border from the outside." Captain Jun Lee nodded slowly. "No, Ambassador, we do not. You guard it from something trying to get in." "Yes." The silence that followed lasted for nearly a minute. Young Mi looked back and forth between the humans and the alien, trying to understand what had just happened. Finally, the Veltaran spoke again. "How long has humanity known about this?" "Since we first reached the stars," Tejo answered, "and we learned it from the species who guarded the boundary before us." The ambassador's metal-like skin had developed stress fractures that leaked a pale blue fluid. "The collective must be warned immediately." Captain Jun Lee walked over to the communication station. "We will arrange for immediate transport back to your home world, Ambassador. And yes, your people will be briefed on the situation as the horizon's edge set course for the nearest Veltaran outpost." Young Mi finally asked the question that had been building in her mind since the encounter. "Captain, what exactly is out there in the silent dark?" Jun Lee looked out at the stars and remembered his first briefing as a young officer when he learned the truth that only humans were allowed to know. Something that makes the space between galaxies look crowded. Ambassador. Ambassador Heijin Cho walked through the curved corridors of Concordia Prime and felt the weight of 300 years of human secrets pressing down on her shoulders. The Galactic Council's emergency session had been called after 12 different species reported missing exploration fleets near human space, and now she had to face questions that humanity had hoped would never be asked. Subin Kang adjusted her security uniform and checked the concealed recording device one more time before taking her position near the council chamber doors. For 6 months she had worked undercover as part of the station's security force, gathering intelligence on which species were becoming too curious about the silent dark. Today, that information would be more valuable than ever. The council chamber was a massive dome filled with representatives from 47 different species, each sitting in environmental pods designed for their specific atmospheric needs. Heijin took her place at the human delegation's platform and looked out at faces that ranged from familiar to completely alien. "The emergency session will now begin," announced the council's artificial intelligence in a voice that somehow managed to sound neutral in 47 different languages simultaneously. The Veltaran representative stood first, and Heijin recognized the same ambassador who had recently returned from human space. The stress fractures in its skin had been repaired, but something in its posture suggested that the psychological damage remained. 3 days ago, I witnessed something beyond human space that challenges everything we thought we knew about the galaxy. The Veltaran began. I call upon the human delegation to explain why they have hidden the existence of ancient structures in the regions they claim as empty. A murmur ran through the chamber as species that had only heard rumors suddenly realized that concrete evidence existed. Heijin stood slowly, knowing that her next words would change galactic politics forever. The regions beyond human space are not empty, she said clearly, but they are not safe for exploration by any known technology. The Thrakari delegate's tentacles writhed in what Heijin recognized as aggressive curiosity. Are you claiming ownership of territories that contain archaeological treasures that rightfully belong to all galactic civilization? Subin Kang listened carefully from her position by the doors while monitoring the security feeds on her portable display. Her real job was to identify which species were planning coordinated action against human space, and right now 3 separate groups were exchanging meaningful glances. We claim ownership of nothing beyond our established borders, Heijin replied. We simply maintain a barrier that protects this galaxy from forces that existed long before any of our species reached the stars. The chamber erupted in voices speaking dozens of different languages as representatives demanded clarification. The artificial intelligence's translation systems struggled to keep up with the overlapping conversations until finally the Zephyrian elder called for order. Ambassador Cho. The elder's crystalline voice cut through the noise. You speak of forces as if they were still active, yet our long-range sensors detect no signs of civilization beyond human space. Heijin looked around the chamber and made a decision that had been authorized by Earth's government only if the situation became desperate. It was time to reveal the first layer of truth. 40,000 years ago, there was another species that guarded the same boundary that humanity now protects. She began. They were called the Architects, and they left behind warnings carved in quantum encrypted stone. The silence that followed was so complete that Subin could hear the hum of the station's life support systems through the chamber's walls. Every representative was now focused entirely on the human ambassador. These warnings speak of entities that exist partially outside normal space-time. Heijin continued, beings that seek to break through into our reality and unravel the fundamental structures that allow matter and energy to exist in stable forms. Du Hyun Seo watched from the visitors' gallery as 3 species military attachés quietly left the chamber. His job was to track exactly who was taking this information seriously enough to begin immediate planning, and who was dismissing it as human propaganda. The Catherian delegate raised one of its 4 heads. You expect us to believe that humanity alone has been entrusted with protecting the galaxy from mythical entities. Not humanity alone. Heijin said. We inherited this responsibility from the architects, who inherited it from another species before them, and that species inherited it from another going back millions of years. Subin's portable display showed concerning movement in the station's docking bays. 3 different species had begun loading supplies onto their fastest ships while the emergency session continued. She made a mental note to report this immediately after the session ended. Where is your evidence of these previous guardian species? Demanded the Veltaran ambassador, who seemed to have recovered some of its diplomatic composure. Heijin activated her delegation's holographic display and showed images that had been classified at the highest levels for 3 centuries. The chamber filled with 3-dimensional representations of ruins that clearly showed the same architectural patterns across millions of years. Each guardian species eventually fell to the forces they were trying to contain, she explained, but not before passing on the knowledge and responsibility to the next species capable of maintaining the barrier. The images showed massive structures that looked both ancient and somehow wrong, as if they had been built according to geometric principles that did not quite match normal space. Several representatives visibly recoiled from the display. Min Woo-yoon coordinated security for the entire station, and his job today was to ensure that no species left Concordia Prime without being thoroughly scanned for any technology that might be dangerous near the silent dark. His teams were already in position at every docking bay. How did humanity come to inherit this burden? asked the Silvani representative whose tree-like form swayed gently as it spoke. The architects made contact with early human civilization and spent centuries preparing us for the responsibility. Hai-Jin answered, "They taught us how to build the monitoring systems and defense networks that currently maintain the barrier." Du Hyun noticed that the military attachés who had left earlier were now returning to the chamber, but they were accompanied by officials he did not recognize. His training told him that major decisions were being made in private communications while the public session continued. What gives humanity the right to make decisions for the entire galaxy without consultation? The Thrakari delegate demanded. Hai-Jin's response was carefully measured. The same right that gives a fire department the authority to establish barrier zones around a dangerous blaze. The artificial intelligence announced a brief recess and representatives immediately began clustering into small groups for urgent conversations. Subin moved through the chamber identifying which species were forming alliances and which were backing away from the entire situation. During the recess, Do-Hyun approached Hai-Jin with information that made her blood run cold. 3 species are coordinating a joint expedition to breach the boundary, he whispered. They believe humanity is hiding technology that could advance their civilizations by thousands of years. When the session resumed, the atmosphere had changed completely. Instead of curiosity and indignation, there was now a clear division between species that accepted humanity's explanation and species that viewed it as an elaborate deception designed to hide valuable resources. The human delegation has presented claims that cannot be verified, announced the Catherian delegate. Therefore, the Catherian Assembly proposes a joint scientific expedition to independently investigate the regions beyond human space. Hai-Jin stood again, knowing that this moment had been inevitable, since the first alien species had developed faster than light travel. Any expedition beyond the barrier will result in consequences that affect the entire galaxy. Are you threatening military action against peaceful scientific exploration? The Veltaran ambassador asked. I am stating a fact about the nature of the entities that exist beyond the silent dark. Hai-Jin replied, they respond to intrusion by expanding their area of influence. Subin's security feeds showed concerning activity throughout the station. Multiple species were now openly loading military equipment onto their vessels, while maintaining the pretense of scientific preparation. The session continued for another hour, with humanity's warnings being dismissed by an increasing number of species. When the council finally adjourned, the vote was clear. A joint expedition would be authorized within 30 days. As representatives filed out of the chamber, Hai-Jin received an encrypted message on her personal communicator. The automated defense systems throughout human space had just activated for the first time in 3 centuries. Do-Hyun joined her at the human delegation platform. The expedition ships are already departing for the boundary. Hai-Jin looked out through the chamber's transparent dome at the stars beyond, and wondered if this would be the last time she saw them looking normal and stable. Then it begins, she said quietly, and may whatever gods these species believe in help us all. Dr. Yoon-ji Moon stood before the massive crystalline structures on the dead world of Threshold, and felt as if she were looking at mathematics made solid. The architect ruins rose from the planet's surface like frozen music, with angles that seemed to shift when she was not looking directly at them. After 15 years of studying xenolinguistics, she thought she understood alien communication, but the architects had left behind something far more complex than language. Wu Jin. Kim monitored the deep space sensors from his station in the ruins' central chamber while trying not to think about what those sensors might detect. For 2 months, his equipment had been picking up gravitational anomalies from beyond the silent dark, and each reading was more disturbing than the last. Something massive was moving out there in the spaces between realities. The translation matrix is finally stabilizing, announced Xiang-Ho Park from his position at the quantum computer array. 6 months of work had gone into developing algorithms capable of interpreting architect communications, and now they were about to discover what the galaxy's previous guardians had been trying to say. Hyewan Lee checked her military research equipment one more time before joining the others around the central translation device. Her job was to analyze any defensive technologies that the architects might have left behind, but so far, Everything they had found operated on principles that human science could barely comprehend. The crystalline structure at the center of the ruins began to glow with soft blue light as Sung-Ho's computers interfaced with systems that had been dormant for 40,000 years. Kyunji felt her breath catch as symbols began appearing in the air above the crystal, like holographic writing that seemed to exist in more than 3 dimensions. Beginning translation sequence, Sung-Ho reported while his computers processed information using quantum algorithms that pushed the boundaries of human technology. The first translated words appeared on their displays, and Yunji realized immediately that they were not reading a message but rather a warning that had been repeated across millions of years by species after species. Reality is layered like the skin of an onion, she read aloud, and we exist only in the outermost layer where the rules of physics create stability and order. Wu Jin's sensor array suddenly activated with readings that made him call out to the others. I'm detecting massive gravitational distortions approaching from coordinates that should be empty space. Hee-Wan moved to assist with the sensor analysis, while Yunji continued reading the architect message. Below our layer of reality exists the deep reality where consciousness functions without the limitations of matter and energy. How far out are those distortions? Hee-Wan asked as she reviewed Wu Jin's data. Approximately 100 light-years beyond the silent dark boundary, but moving toward us at speeds that should be impossible, he replied. Sung-Ho's computers continued processing the architect records while strange harmonics filled the air around the crystal structure. The translation is revealing multiple layers of information, he reported. It appears the architect's embedded memory engrams directly into the quantum matrix. Yunji watched as the holographic display expanded to show 3-dimensional models of cosmic structures that defied her understanding of physics. The entities from the deep reality are called unmakers, she continued reading, because they do not destroy matter but rather unravel the concept of existence itself. The memory engrams that Sung-Ho had mentioned began manifesting as ghostly figures that appeared around the crystal. The team watched in amazement as translucent architects began moving through the chamber, repeating actions they had performed 40,000 years ago. This is incredible, Hee-Wan whispered. We're seeing actual architect scientists working at these same stations. One of the ghostly figures turned toward Yunji and began speaking in harmonics that the translation system converted into human language. The convergence cycle occurs every 100,000 years when the barriers between realities weaken, and the unmakers test the boundaries of ordered space. Wu Jin's sensors registered another gravitational anomaly, and this one was much closer than the others. The distortions are accelerating, he announced, and they're following a pattern that matches the architect warnings about convergence events. The ghostly architect scientist continued its explanation, while other figures worked frantically at crystalline control panels. Each guardian species faces the same choice when the convergence begins: transcend physical existence to strengthen the barriers, or fall to the unmakers and leave the galaxy defenseless. Yunji felt a chill run down her spine as she realized what the architect was describing. They didn't fall to the unmakers, she said to the others. They chose to become part of the silent dark itself. Sung-Ho's computers processed deeper layers of the quantum recording and revealed images that showed the final days of architect civilization. They merged their consciousness with space-time itself, he reported, becoming living components of the barrier between realities. The ghostly figures began to fade, but not before the lead scientist delivered one final message directly to Onji. Humanity's turn has come 3 centuries early, it said. The convergence that should have occurred in 90,000 years has been accelerated by activities in the deep reality. Hee-Wan looked up from her analysis of Wu Jin's sensor data with an expression of growing alarm. The gravitational anomalies are not random, she announced. They're forming a pattern that suggests coordinated movement by multiple massive entities. How many entities? Yunji asked, while trying to process the implications of everything they had learned. Based on the gravitational signatures, at least 12 objects each with mass equivalent to a small moon, but with density readings that fluctuate outside normal parameters, Wu Jin replied. The crystal structure pulsed with brighter light, and Suddenly, new information flooded their translation systems. Seung-ho watched as his computers struggled to process data streams that seemed to contain the accumulated knowledge of an entire civilization. The architects left more than warnings, he announced. They left a complete technical database including instructions for technologies that could enhance the Silent Dark's defensive capabilities. Yoonji reviewed the new information and felt her heart sink as she understood what it meant. The technologies require human consciousness as a power source, she said quietly, just like the architects had to sacrifice their physical existence. The chamber filled with harmonics that seemed to resonate directly with their nervous systems as more architect memory engrams activated. This time the ghostly figures showed them images of the convergence event that had ended their civilization. They watched reality itself seem to tear like fabric as massive entities pushed through from the deep reality. The Unmakers appeared as shifting geometric forms that hurt to look at directly because they existed in more dimensions than human vision could process. The architects' final battle was not fought with weapons, Haiwan observed. They used their own life force to reinforce the barriers between realities. Wu Jin's sensors suddenly registered proximity alarms as one of the gravitational anomalies approached the edge of the Silent Dark. Whatever is out there just made contact with the boundary, he reported. The crystal structure began pulsing with urgent light patterns, while the translation system delivered a final message from the architect records. The convergence has begun, and humanity must choose quickly, appeared on their displays. Delay will result in the collapse of reality barriers and the spread of chaos throughout ordered space. Yoonji looked around at her colleagues and realized that they had just become the most important people in human civilization. The knowledge they had gained would determine whether humanity followed the architect's path or found another way to face the convergence. We need to contact Earth immediately, she said, and hope that 3 centuries of preparation will be enough. Seung-ho began shutting down the quantum interface while the architect crystal gradually returned to dormancy. The technical specifications for consciousness-based defense systems are now in our database, he reported, but implementing them will require volunteers who understand that the process is irreversible. Haiwan gathered her military research data while watching Wu Jin's sensors track the movement of entities that existed partially outside normal space. How long do we have before the convergence reaches critical phase, she asked. Based on the architect records and current gravitational readings, Yoonji replied after consulting the translation database, approximately 6 months before the first major reality distortions begin manifesting in normal space. As their shuttle lifted off from Threshold's surface, carrying the most important information in human history, the team watched the architect ruins fade into the distance. Behind them, the crystal structures continued to pulse with faint light as ancient warning systems activated for the first time in 40,000 years. The convergence had begun, and humanity would soon face the same terrible choice that had transformed every guardian species before them. Admiral Sang Woo-jang stood on the bridge of the dreadnought Eternal Vigil and watched as reality itself began to fray at the edges of human space. His hidden defense fleet had remained secret for 3 centuries, but now 12 massive ships faced an enemy that conventional weapons could not touch. The first Unmaker entities had begun probing the Silent Dark's barriers, and space around them rippled like water disturbed by stones. Dr. Miran-Oh worked frantically in her quantum laboratory deep within the flagship as she tried to unlock the final secrets of architect technology. The consciousness interface systems were nearly complete, but each test revealed new complexities that pushed human science beyond its limits. According to the ancient records, only trained individuals with specific genetic markers could safely merge with the Silent Dark's defensive matrix. Admiral, we have visual contact with the lead entity, reported the sensor officer whose voice carried barely controlled terror. Sang-woo turned to the main display and felt his mind struggle to process what appeared there. The Unmaker was not a ship or creature, but rather a geometric impossibility that seemed to exist in several dimensions simultaneously. Looking at it directly caused headaches as human brains tried to interpret shapes that had no equivalent in normal space. Commander Byung-ho Nam prepared his interface squad volunteers in the ship's specialized combat bay, while trying not to think about what the process would do to their minds. 24 men and women had stepped forward knowing that merging with the Silent Dark's defenses would gradually erase their personalities until only echoes remained. "First wave of conventional weapons ready for firing," announced the tactical officer. "Fire!" ordered Admiral Sang-woo. The Eternal Vigil's main guns launched projectiles that could destroy planets, but when the weapons reached the Unmaker entity, they simply ceased to exist. Not destroyed or deflected, but erased as if they had never been manufactured at all. HFY coordinated communications between the scattered elements of humanity's defense force, while monitoring the psychological state of crews who were witnessing things that normal minds were not designed to comprehend. 3 ships had already reported crew members going catatonic after staring too long at the approaching entities. "Dr. O reports that the first interface squad is ready for deployment," she announced to Admiral Sang-woo. Mi-ran-o watched as Commander Byung-ho Nam and his volunteers entered the consciousness interface chambers that had been built according to architect specifications. The process required each volunteer to gradually merge their awareness with quantum fields that existed partially in the deep reality. Beginning interface sequence, she reported while monitoring bio-readings that showed human consciousness expanding beyond normal parameters. The first volunteer was Lieutenant Soo-jin Park, who had studied the architect records for months in preparation for this moment. As the interface activated, her awareness suddenly expanded to encompass vast regions of space-time, while her individual personality began dissolving into something larger. "I can see it." Soo-jin's voice came through the communication system, but it no longer sounded entirely human. "The Unmaker is not trying to enter our reality, but rather to convince our reality that it does not exist." Admiral Sang-woo felt the ship's hull vibrate with harmonics that seemed to come from the fabric of space itself. "Status report on the entity's approach." "Distance is meaningless to it," reported the sensor officer. "It exists here and there simultaneously, but the Silent Dark's barriers are forcing it to choose a single location." Commander Byung-ho entered his own interface chamber and felt his consciousness expand until he could perceive the cosmic battle taking place, on levels that human language could not describe. The Unmaker entities were not attacking the barriers, but rather questioning their existence through forms of communication that operated according to the laws of the deep reality. Dr. Mi-ran-o monitored the interface squad's vital signs as one by one their individual personalities dissolved into the quantum defense matrix. "Neural integration proceeding normally," she reported, "but we're losing their human identity markers." HFY established communication links with the interface squad members who could still speak in human language. "What are you experiencing?" she asked Commander Byung-ho. "I am becoming part of the barrier itself," his voice replied, but it now carried harmonics that hurt to hear. "The Unmakers are trying to convince spacetime that matter and energy are illusions that should be abandoned." The main display showed the lead Unmaker entity approaching the Silent Dark's outer defenses, while reality distortion spread outward from its location. Several nearby stars flickered as the fundamental constants that governed nuclear fusion momentarily became unstable. "Second wave entities detected," announced the sensor officer. 11 more signatures approaching from different vectors. Admiral Sang-woo realized that humanity was facing a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm the Silent Dark's defenses through multiple simultaneous attacks. All ships moved to defensive positions around the primary barrier generators. Mi-ran-o watched her instruments register impossible readings as the interface squad members completed their transformation into living components of the quantum defense system. "Integration complete," she reported. "The volunteers are now permanently merged with the Silent Dark's matrix." The battle that followed was unlike anything in recorded history because it was fought with competing concepts of existence rather than conventional weapons. The Unmaker entities projected waves of doubt that questioned whether matter should maintain stable atomic structures, while the interface squad responded with assertions of reality's fundamental validity. Commander Byung-ho's consciousness now existed simultaneously across multiple regions of space-time as he directed defensive responses against entities that attacked the very concept of ordered existence. His human memories were fading, but his commitment to protecting the galaxy remained constant. Reality distortions detected throughout the outer colonies, reported HFY, as reports flooded in from across human space. Atmospheric gases are temporarily forgetting how to maintain molecular cohesion. The lead Unmaker entity suddenly changed its approach and began pressing directly against the Silent Dark's primary barrier. The quantum matrix that the architects had constructed 40,000 years ago began showing stress fractures as something vast and alien tested its structural integrity. Barrier strength at 60% and declining, announced Dr. Miran O. Admiral Sangwoo watched the tactical display as his conventional fleet proved completely useless against enemies that existed partially outside normal physics. Only the interface squad could engage the Unmakers, and each battle cost humanity. Irreplaceable volunteers who dissolved into quantum static. Third interface squad ready for deployment, reported the tactical officer. Deploy immediately, ordered the admiral, while knowing that he was sending more brave souls to a fate that was arguably worse than death. The newest volunteers entered their interface chambers and began the process of transcending human consciousness. Lin Youngmin Yu had volunteered despite watching his friends from the first squad fade into echoes of their former selves. As his awareness expanded beyond individual identity, Youngmin suddenly understood what the Unmakers truly were. They were not evil in any sense that humans could comprehend, but rather representatives of a form of existence that considered organized matter to be a temporary aberration that should be corrected. They believe they are helping us, his transformed voice reported through the communication system, by freeing consciousness from the limitations of physical existence. The battle reached its climax when the lead Unmaker entity managed to create a small breach in the Silent Dark's barriers. Reality distortions immediately began spreading outward as the laws of physics became unstable in an expanding sphere around the breach. Commander Byung-ho directed all remaining interface squad members to focus their combined consciousness on sealing the breach, while Dr. Ni Mireno monitored power levels that were dropping toward critical minimums. Barrier integrity restored, she finally announced as the last interface squad volunteer dissolved into the quantum matrix. But we've lost 18 more people to the defense system. Admiral Sangwoo watched as the Unmaker entities gradually withdrew beyond the Silent Dark's borders, but he knew this had only been a probing attack designed to test humanity's defenses. Damage report, he requested. Minimal physical damage to the fleet, reported HFY Kim, but we've lost 36 volunteers to the interface system and barrier strength is reduced to 40% of normal levels, Dr. Miran O reviewed her data logs while trying to estimate how many more interface squad volunteers would be needed to face the full convergence event. Based on power consumption during this engagement, she announced, we will need approximately 2,000 volunteers to maintain defensive capabilities during the primary assault. The implications of that number hung heavy in the air as everyone realized what it meant. Defending the galaxy would require humanity to sacrifice a significant portion of its population to the quantum defense matrix. Admiral reported the sensor officer. Long-range scans detect massive gravitational signatures massing beyond the Silent Dark's outer boundary. Sangwoo looked out at the stars and realized that the real battle had not yet begun. President Ji-Hyun Choi stood before the assembled leaders of humanity and felt the weight of an impossible decision crushing down on her shoulders. The holographic displays around the emergency council chamber showed real-time images of reality, distortions spreading through the outer colonies as the full convergence event approached. In 6 hours, the Unmaker entities would launch their final assault, and humanity had only one way to stop them. Dongmin Yu was the last interface squad leader who still retained enough individual consciousness to communicate with normal humans, and his report painted a grim picture of humanity's remaining defenses. Half of the Silent Dark's quantum barriers had been damaged during the initial probing attacks, and repairing them would require a massive infusion of human consciousness. The architect records are clear, announced Dr. Sujin Bei as she presented her philosophical analysis to the assembled leaders. Every guardian species eventually faces the same choice between transcendence and extinction. The debate that followed would determine the fate of not just humanity, but the entire galaxy. Some council members argued that sacrificing human civilization to save alien species was morally indefensible, while others insisted that allowing the Unmakers to succeed would mean the end of all organized existence. Kyung-Suk Han spoke through the quantum communication array that allowed her architect consciousness to interface with human technology. Her voice carried harmonics from 40,000 years of existence as a living component of the Silent Dark's defenses. The choice appears difficult only from the perspective of individual survival, she explained. But consciousness that merges with the quantum matrix does not die, but rather becomes part of something infinitely larger. President Ji-hyun listened to the arguments while monitoring reports from across human space. Reality storms were already manifesting in 3-star systems as the barriers between dimensions continued to weaken. Citizens on the outer worlds were experiencing hallucinations as their local spacetime became unstable. How many volunteers would be required for a complete merger? She asked Dongmin. Based on our power consumption analysis, approximately 15 million people to create a self-sustaining quantum barrier, he replied with a voice that no longer sounded entirely human. The number sent shockwaves through the council chamber as representatives realized the scale of sacrifice that would be required. Dr. Soo-Jin Bae had spent months studying the philosophical implications, but even she struggled with the magnitude of what they were discussing. 15 million people would represent nearly half of humanity's total population, observed the colonial defense minister. But the alternative is the complete dissolution of organized reality throughout this galaxy, countered the Science Council representative. Kyung-Suk Han's architect consciousness provided additional perspective that only deepened the moral complexity. When my species faced the convergence, we discovered that merging with the quantum matrix preserves the essential elements of consciousness while eliminating the limitations of individual existence. President Ji-hyun activated the emergency communication channels that connected her to every human settlement throughout known space. The decision could not be made by the council alone because it would affect every man, woman, and child in human civilization. Citizens of humanity, she began her address. We face a choice that will determine not only our future but the survival of all intelligent life in this galaxy. She explained the situation as clearly as possible while trying to help people understand concepts that pushed the boundaries of human comprehension. The Unmaker entities were not evil, but they represented a form of existence that was fundamentally incompatible with the organized matter that made planets, stars, and living beings possible. Response from the colonies began flooding the communication networks within minutes. Families discussed the implications while scientists debated the technical details, and philosophers struggled with questions that had no precedent in human history. Dr. Soo-Jin Bae monitored the public response while analyzing the psychological profiles of potential volunteers. Initial surveys suggest that approximately 30% of the population would consider volunteering if the alternative was total extinction. That would provide more than enough consciousness to stabilize the barriers permanently, reported Dongmin, while his own individual identity continued fading into the quantum matrix. The breakthrough came when ships from 47 different alien species arrived at the border of human space, carrying not weapons, but gifts. The galactic community had finally understood what humanity had been protecting them from, and they came offering everything they could provide. The Veltaran Collective is requesting permission to preserve complete records of human culture and history, announced the communications minister. The Thrakari Assembly wants to establish breeding populations of humans on worlds far from the Silent Dark, added the colonial affairs representative. President Ji-hyun realized that the galaxy was offering humanity a form of immortality that did not require quantum transcendence. Human civilization could continue in preserved form, while volunteers maintained the barriers that protected organized existence. The Zephyrian Confederacy has developed technology that can preserve human consciousness in crystalline matrices, reported the Science Council. Volunteers could maintain their individual identities while contributing to the quantum defense system. This possibility changed the entire debate, because it meant that volunteers would not lose their humanity, but rather exist simultaneously as individuals and as components of the Galactic Defense Network. Dongmin tested the alien consciousness preservation technology and reported that it successfully maintained individual identity while allowing full integration with the Silent Dark's quantum barriers. I can feel myself as both Dongmin Yu and as part of something vast and protective, he explained. The volunteer response was overwhelming, once people understood that they could preserve their consciousness while protecting everything they cared about. Entire families volunteered together rather than face separation, and military units requested group assignments to the Quantum Defense Matrix. Current volunteer registrations exceed 20 million people, announced Dr. Sujin Bei, and applications continue arriving from every colony world. President Ji Hyun made the final decision as reality distortions reached critical levels throughout human space. Authorization granted for full implementation of the Quantum Consciousness Transfer Protocol. The transformation began at transfer stations throughout human space as volunteers entered crystalline matrices that preserved their individual awareness while linking them to the silent dark's defensive systems. Families said goodbye to physical existence while maintaining emotional connections through quantum entanglement. Young Soo Kim was among the first volunteers, and his experience set the pattern for millions who followed. As his consciousness merged with the quantum matrix, he felt his individual identity expand to encompass vast regions of space-time while retaining memories of his childhood on Earth. "I am still Young Soo," his transformed voice reported, "but I am also part of something that protects every star in the galaxy." The final battle with the Unmaker entities was fought entirely on the level of competing concepts as 15 million human consciousnesses asserted the fundamental validity of organized existence against entities that sought to convince reality that matter was an illusion. The convergence reached its climax when the lead Unmaker entity attempted to project universal doubt that would have caused atomic structures throughout the galaxy to lose cohesion. The human consciousness matrix responded with combined certainty about the value and validity of organized matter. Reality barriers holding at maximum strength, reported the monitoring stations as the Unmaker assault gradually weakened against humanity's absolute commitment to protecting the galaxy. The entities withdrew beyond the deep reality threshold, but the quantum consciousness matrix remained active as a permanent immune system for organized space-time. 15 million humans now existed as both individuals and as living components of the Galactic Defense Network. President Ji Hyun addressed the remaining physical human population from Earth as ships from dozens of species worked to preserve every aspect of human culture for future generations. "We have chosen to become guardians not through conquest or obligation, but through love," she announced. "Love for the galaxy that gave us the stars, and love for the countless species who share this magnificent cosmos with us." The galaxy's borders still stopped at human space, but now everyone understood that this was not about territory or politics. It was about consciousness itself, taking responsibility for protecting the fundamental structures that allowed beauty, truth, and wonder to exist. In the quantum realm that bridged normal space and the deep reality, 15 million human souls sang lullabies to the stars while standing eternal watch against the chaos that sought to unmake everything they held dear. The child who asked why the stars whispered received an answer that would echo through generations. They were listening to the voices of those who loved them enough to become something greater than human, in order to ensure that humanity and all life could continue to flourish among the infinite possibilities of an ordered universe.